When we speak of Israel's current predicament, it is essential to begin with the reality that its regional deterrence once formidable, even awe-inspiring, has begun to collapse. For decades, Israel maintained dominance through a doctrine of overwhelming force. The strategy was straightforward: strike hard, strike fast, and make your enemies fear the cost of resistance. That model worked, until it didn't. What we're seeing now, particularly after the conflicts of 2023 and 2024, is a deep structural shift. Israel's adversaries, especially non-state actors like Hezbollah and Hamas, are no longer deterred in the traditional sense. They operate under a radically different cost-benefit calculus. For them, survival and symbolism are more valuable than tactical wins or losses. Hezbollah, for instance, has transformed from a guerrilla force into a quasi-army with precision-guided missile capability. Hamas, despite being encircled and bombarded, continues to rebuild, adapt, and launch. These groups no longer fear the consequences of provoking Israel. They anticipate it, in fact, and leverage Israel's military responses to galvanize popular support, both domestically and internationally. Moreover, the regional landscape has changed. The Abraham Accords were celebrated as a diplomatic breakthrough, and in some ways they were. But normalization with peripheral Arab states has done little to alter the fundamental hostility that brews in the heart of the Levant. Iran has grown more entrenched in Syria. Iraq and Yemen are no longer passive players. Turkey has recalibrated its posture, increasingly vocal in its opposition to Israeli actions. The result is a ring of resistance stretching from Tehran to Beirut to Gaza, an arc that's more ideologically hardened, more strategically networked, and crucially more patient. Israel now finds itself encircled not just geographically, but psychologically. The fear that once acted as a buffer, keeping rockets grounded, militias in hiding, and leaders hesitant, has faded. Deterrence, after all, is not just a military calculation. It is psychological warfare. And psychology, like credibility, is fragile. Once broken, it is difficult to restore. Every failed campaign, every inconclusive war, every high-tech weapon that fails to stop low-tech resistance chips away at that once indomitable reputation. This loss of strategic deterrence coincides with growing international scrutiny. Civilian casualties are no longer easily dismissed. The global media ecosystem, powered by decentralized narratives and real-time footage, reshapes public perception almost instantly. Israel's military responses, however justified from a strategic standpoint, often appear disproportionate in a moral frame. And morality, as much as missiles, is now part of the battlefield. Here's the paradox: the stronger Israel tries to appear, the more isolated it becomes. Military strength without political foresight, without strategic humility, creates the illusion of security while quietly accelerating instability. So, Israel stands at a crossroads. It can either reassess its posture, acknowledging that brute force no longer ensures dominance, or it can continue down a path of repeated tactical victories that yield strategic defeat. History doesn't reward the powerful, it rewards the adaptive. The question now is whether Israel, for all its strength, is willing to adapt. Power that no longer inspires fear, but invites resistance, is not power at all. It is burden masquerading as control. If we're being intellectually honest, the two-state solution is no longer a viable political outcome. It is a dead letter. For years, policymakers in Washington, Tel Aviv, and European capitals treated it like a sacred doctrine. The idea was simple: partition the land, give Palestinians a state, preserve Israel's Jewish and democratic character. In theory, it was elegant. In practice, it was always fragile. And today, it's been overtaken by demographic and territorial realities that no diplomatic rhetoric can paper over. Israel's relentless expansion of settlements in the West Bank, now home to over 700,000 Israelis, has created a geopolitical map that renders meaningful separation virtually impossible. What exists is a fragmented archipelago of Palestinian enclaves, non-contiguous, militarily controlled, economically dependent. There is no space for sovereignty here. What exists is not a future Palestinian state, but a permanent system of domination. To pretend otherwise is to indulge in fantasy. This is where the apartheid analogy emerges, not from rhetorical excess, but from sober observation. When one ethnic group controls the land, the borders, the airspace, the population registry, the resources, and even the movement of another group, all without granting them equal rights or national sovereignty, we are dealing with a system that is not democratic, not liberal, and certainly not temporary. Numerous human rights organizations, Israeli, Palestinian, International, have reached this conclusion, and the label is gaining traction, not just on the streets, but in the halls of Western institutions. And here's the deeper psychological dilemma. Israel finds itself trapped in a moral contradiction. It wants to be both a Jewish state and a democratic state. Yet the longer it controls millions of Palestinians without enfranchising them, the more it undermines both claims. You cannot have permanent control without consent and still claim democratic legitimacy. And you cannot maintain an ethno-national identity without confronting the inevitable charge of exclusion. For a time, Israel could sustain this duality by projecting the idea that peace was just over the horizon, that negotiations were stalled, not failed, but that fiction has collapsed. No serious analyst believes a viable Palestinian state is emerging from this structure. And without that alternative, the only remaining reality is a one-state arrangement that privileges one group over another. That is not stability, it is slow-motion crisis. This is not just a political problem, it is a crisis of moral psychology. It corrodes from within. The longer Israel tries to preserve this status quo, the more it alienates the very liberal democracies whose support it depends on. The more it insists on control without compromise, the more it erodes its own image, first abroad, then at home. The world sees this contradiction, and increasingly it will choose to act, not because of anti-Israel bias, but because systems that perpetuate permanent inequality eventually collapse under their own weight. A state that governs without granting rights is not preserving its democracy. It's writing its obituary. For decades, Israel's strategic confidence rested on one central pillar: unwavering American support. That alliance has been deep, extensive, and, until recently, almost immune to challenge. Washington supplied not only military aid and diplomatic cover, but also legitimacy. When the United States backed Israel, it sent a clear signal to the rest of the world. Israel was untouchable. That perception alone deterred countless political and legal challenges. But that world is changing, and changing fast. The assumption that American support is permanent, unconditional, and bipartisan is no longer credible. Yes, the upper echelons of Congress, the defense establishment, and major lobbying groups still largely align with Israeli policy. But beneath that surface, public opinion is shifting, especially among younger Americans, progressives, and even some veterans of U.S. foreign policy who increasingly view Israel not as a strategic asset, but as a moral and diplomatic liability. Poll after poll reveals growing sympathy for the Palestinian cause among American youth. On college campuses, in civil society, across social media platforms, Israel's actions are no longer viewed through the lens of security, but through the prism of power imbalance and human rights violations. The October 7th attack by Hamas shocked many, but the response in Gaza, which has led to staggering civilian casualties, has generated a level of outrage not seen in prior conflicts. This matters profoundly because political culture is downstream of public sentiment. What's considered fringe today often becomes policy tomorrow. Even within the Democratic Party, fractures are growing. Prominent lawmakers have begun openly questioning U.S. aid to Israel. For the first time in modern memory, proposals to condition military assistance, something previously unthinkable, are gaining traction. The center of gravity is moving, and Israel's traditional political playbook is starting to lose its effectiveness. The language of shared values and strategic necessity rings hollow to a generation more concerned with equality, justice, and post-colonial critique than with Cold War-era alliances. From a realist standpoint, this poses a serious problem. Israel's military edge, while formidable, has always been bolstered by U.S. vetoes at the UN, U.S. funding for advanced weapons systems, and U.S. shielding from international investigations. If that protective umbrella begins to fray, even slightly, Israel's entire strategic environment becomes more precarious. And let's be clear, this isn't about some sudden betrayal. It's about a slow erosion of alignment. As the U.S. grapples with its own internal crises and recalibrates its global commitments, particularly toward China and the Indo-Pacific, the cost-benefit logic of supporting Israel unconditionally starts to weaken. Support that's rooted in sentiment cannot endure without strategic rationale. And when sentiment shifts as it now is, strategic clarity must follow. Israel must confront this reality with humility, not denial. It cannot afford to confuse temporary loyalty with permanent alliance, nor can it expect American patience to outlast American interest. Unconditional support is only ever unconditional until it's not. And when the cost of loyalty outweighs the strategic return, even the closest allies begin to reconsider what exactly they're defending. There is a brutal demographic truth at the heart of Israel's long-term dilemma, one that its leaders have refused to confront head-on. Between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there are now roughly equal numbers of Jews and Palestinians. In fact, depending on how you count, Palestinians may already constitute the majority. And this is not just a statistical curiosity. It is a foundational crisis. Because Israel, as it currently governs this territory, maintains full sovereignty while denying full political rights to millions of those under its control. That is a formula not for democracy, but for permanent instability. The logic of Zionism was always tied to the idea of a Jewish democratic state. But that model depends on maintaining a Jewish majority within clearly defined borders. And here's the problem. Israel never finalized those borders. It expanded, it occupied, and it settled, without resolving the core contradiction. Now it rules over a binational population while insisting on ethno-national identity. The result is what some call a de facto one-state reality, one where one group enjoys full rights and protections and the other lives in a state of permanent subordination. This is not sustainable. No state in modern history has successfully maintained this kind of asymmetry indefinitely. You can control people through force, you can suppress dissent, you can build walls and checkpoints, but you cannot erase demographics. You cannot govern 5 million people without enfranchising them and still claim to be a democracy. At some point, the world begins to recognize the obvious, that what exists is not an occupation awaiting resolution, but a regime of control that has become permanent by design. And here lies the deeper psychological and moral cost. When a society commits itself to preserving dominance over a population, it will not integrate. It begins to erode from within. It militarizes itself. it grows fearful and insular. It teaches its young that survival requires endless vigilance, and that equality is a threat to identity. This is not strength. It is fragility disguised as nationalism. The demographic trend line cannot be reversed. Palestinians are not going away. They are not disappearing, not assimilating, not surrendering. They are part of the land, as rooted as any other people. The only real question is whether Israel will continue down a path of managing the problem through coercion, or whether it will find the courage to imagine a different political future, one based not on permanent majority rule, but on shared legitimacy. What makes this moment so dangerous is that time is not on Israel's side. Every year that passes without a political resolution further entrenches the system, further hardens identities, and further isolates Israel from the moral consensus of the world. The longer it delays, the more difficult it becomes to find a way out that preserves both security and justice. You cannot build a future on a demographic foundation that denies equality. Power may dictate the present, but legitimacy shapes the future. For most of its modern existence, Israel operated in a world dominated by a single superpower, the United States. In that unipolar moment, being aligned with Washington carried immense strategic weight. It meant access to advanced military technologies, diplomatic immunity, and protection from the consequences of international law. Israel leveraged this relationship to great effect, often acting with a degree of impunity that would be unthinkable for most states. But the global order that made this possible is evaporating before our eyes. We are now firmly entering a multipolar world. China is rising, Russia is resurgent, middle powers like Turkey, Iran, and even Gulf states are asserting their own spheres of influence. This shift isn't just academic, it's transformational. The old alliances no longer function as they once did, and the logic of global diplomacy is becoming transactional. In such a world where every actor is looking to maximize short-term strategic gains, Israel's value proposition is far less compelling. The truth is, Israel was indispensable when it served as a stable pro-Western outpost in a volatile Middle East. But now the energy dynamics are changing, regional actors are recalibrating, and the U.S. itself is shifting focus to the Indo-Pacific. The geopolitical gravity is moving eastward. And in this new reality, Israel finds itself increasingly isolated. Still strong militarily, but less central strategically. For many rising powers, its association with the declining American order is a liability, not an asset. This is compounded by the growing unease around Israel's internal politics. Its recent embrace of far-right coalitions, erosion of judicial independence, and aggressive settlement expansion have not gone unnoticed. In a world where legitimacy matters more than ever, especially for small states surrounded by criticism, Israel's standing is eroding fast, and multipolarity means fewer friends willing to shield it from the consequences. Countries like Brazil, South Africa, and even traditional Western allies are starting to recalibrate their stances, often siding with Palestinian narratives in international forums, not because they are hostile, but because the moral and strategic cost of silence is rising. The irony is striking. Israel once saw itself as a beacon of modernity, science, and democracy in a troubled region. But now, it is increasingly viewed as a relic of a bygone era, an ethno-nationalist state clinging to Cold War alliances in a world that is rapidly outgrowing them. Its diplomatic tool, kit built on historical memory and military prowesses, proving ineffective in a world driven by economics, soft power, and normative legitimacy. If Israel does not adapt to this emerging multipolarity, it will find itself strategically irrelevant, powerful but peripheral, armed but alone. That is not a position of strength. It is a prelude to crisis. In a multipolar world, survival belongs not to the most powerful, but to the most adaptable. An adaptation begins when a nation stops mistaking its past importance for future inevitability. One of the most underappreciated dynamics in Israel's strategic unraveling is not external, it's internal. It's the deep and enduring belief, woven into the fabric of Israeli political culture, that permanent superiority, military, moral, historical, is both natural and sustainable. This conviction has shaped its policies for decades. It fuels the notion that overwhelming force can secure lasting peace, that moral exceptionalism can justify extraordinary actions, and that the past can endlessly validate the present. But this belief, while comforting, is dangerously misleading. The assumption of superiority creates a psychological blind spot. It makes it difficult to perceive limits, to admit failure, or to course correct when strategies no longer work. Every challenge is interpreted not as a consequence of flawed policy, but as evidence of external hostility. Every act of resistance is framed as irrational hatred, rather than a response to structural injustice. This mindset, though perhaps understandable given Israel's traumatic history, prevents genuine introspection. It disables the feedback loop that healthy democracies rely on to survive and evolve. We've seen this pattern unfold repeatedly. The more Israel doubles down on military solutions, the more it alienates even its allies. The more it suppresses dissent within its own society, the more fragile its democratic institutions become. The more it insists that criticism equals antisemitism, the more it silences vital debate at home and abroad. In clinging to the narrative of moral infallibility, it ignores the growing disconnect between itself, image, and how the rest of the world sees it. There's a dangerous irony here. The very belief in moral superiority, intended to protect the state, ends up undermining it. It leads to a kind of strategic arrogance, where power is used as a substitute for legitimacy, and victory is mistaken for wisdom. But history is littered with examples of powerful states that collapsed not because they were defeated militarily, but because they refused to reimagine themselves. They fell because they could not adapt, because they clung too tightly to myths that no longer served them. Israel is not immune to this pattern. It stands at a moment where its self-conception as a light unto nations is being challenged by the reality of what it has become. A nation that controls millions of people without granting them rights, that increasingly isolates itself through its actions, and that treats critique not as a call for accountability, but as betrayal. This is not a crisis of survival. Israel remains powerful. It is a crisis of meaning, of legitimacy, of moral clarity. And those crises are the most dangerous because they erode slowly, from the inside out, until what remains is power without purpose. A nation that mistakes its moral superiority for strategic wisdom is not leading, it's drifting. And if it does not awaken from this illusion, the world will not destroy it. It will simply stop listening.